had to deliver 96 net hires in 4 months with 2 recruiters. Of those that we hired, 83 of them were still there after the 90 days. And I share that because more than the speed and the urgency that matters, to me, it's all about retention. So where I start is making sure that we're super clear. We get crystal clear on what you're looking for. When you are desperately hiring and it feels like you're moving slow, it feels counterintuitive, but you need to balance with the fact that when you churn everybody so quickly, you're actually having this ripple effect in your company, and financially it's not a good business model anyway. When you're looking at interviewing, a lot of times it's a checkbox. Did I ask this question? Yes, cool, check. But you're not actually listening to evaluate. And so I would say oftentimes the follow-up questions are underestimated and often skipped.
Welcome to IDD Leader, where human services leaders grow their impact, lead with heart, and build the workplaces our field deserves. I'm your host, Nate Beers. Let's dive in. When staff retention is going well at your organization, man, the sky is the limit. And I know that in this field, that could feel like a mythical journey, like trying to find the city of El Dorado or trying to find a Buffalo Bills Super Bowl ring. It just doesn't exist, except it does exist. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about the flip side of the same coin, which is recruitment. And we're going to hear from Holli Beth Clauser. She's the founder and owner of ABA C.A.R.E.S Staffing. She knows all about recruiting and has done some pretty amazing things when it comes to getting people hired, including, as you'll hear early in the episode, a time when she had to get something like 90 people hired in several months. Oh my goodness, I can't wait for you to hear the story. But as you're listening, I want you to key in on how can we improve our recruitment to improve our retention, and how can we improve our retention to improve our recruiting, because they are so connected. So you don't have to wonder, what's recruitment got to do with it? After today's episode, you'll know. Without further ado or any more bad jokes, enjoy my conversation with Holli Beth. Let's just jump right in. You've got 60 days and you need to hire 15 new frontline staff. Now, I know in your world, that's probably more like RBTs. In our world, we got another acronym, DSPs. Here's my question. Where do you start and what do you not waste time on?
So I've actually lived this version of this question. I had to deliver 96 net hires in 4 months with 2 recruiters, one who I needed to train from scratch, one who I realized needed complete retraining. We fell short about 10 of those. We fell short on, but of those that we hired, 83 of them were still there after the 90 days. And I share that because more than the speed and the urgency that matters, to me, it's all about retention. So where I start is making sure that we're super clear. We get crystal clear on what you're looking for. What are your exact hours that you need, the specific skill sets, the locations, the schedules that we're trying to listen for, because any sort of vague requirements create a whole bunch of wasted time for the recruiters. And then eventually for staffing, it doesn't work out and you can't keep the hires that we make anyway. So number one, I get real clear so that it can help your sourcing, your job posting, your screening, your interview evaluations, your marketing, all of it. And then I double down on where you had your last or best hires from, and I will look there. Another thing that I like to go to is, who were your almost hires? So who could you not close before that maybe we are, pretty hot still or warm, that we can circle back to and see if the circumstance changed, if schedules change, whatnot. And that's just a real quick win to start with your warm list. And then, I might ask as well your staff and see if there is anybody that anybody can refer. Those are the places that I would start right away with such a high urgency need. And what I don't waste time on, you asked as well, like our Band-Aids. So just filling butts and seats. So I don't
Mm.
do that. I'm not your girl. So if you're like, hey, we just need bodies and we're not doing the intake and we're not going to, spend time on showing you any past data or interest in that, I'm probably not working with you. So, but if you are interested in that, then I'll focus on that. So some of the waste of times for when you're going super quick is interviewing everybody and just getting as many people that you can talk to as much. So I don't do that. I get really clear on not talking to my maybe resumes, and working on applicant flow. So if you're having an applicant flow problem, that might be a different answer. So maybe we do need to get more and spend more time on talking to the ones that are maybes because there's not a lot of applicant flow. So my questions on what I wouldn't spend time for probably differs based on the company and what the exact needs are. But yeah, I would say that job fair is obviously way too long, a lot of big effort, a lot of slow return. So things where you have to nurture the relationships, those are also things that I would pass on potentially, focusing on.
Wow, that was I can't wait to circle back to some of those things. I think I might have hit a sweet spot of so this is right up your alley for sure. I mean, I kind of knew that it was from talking beforehand, but there was a lot there. But before I go any further on that, I do want to just have you kind of introduce yourself. So there's probably listeners not familiar with you. A lot of our listeners aren't necessarily even that familiar with kind of the ABA world, or just, again, it varies. Some might be very familiar. But share about yourself, your work with ABA C.A.R.E.S, the podcast that you host, and yeah, let's just go with that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm Holli Beth. I'm the founder of ABA C.A.R.E.S, which stands for Culture, Advocacy, Retention, Employee Relations, and Systems. I've been in the ABA field, so applied behavior analysis field, for over 21 years, doing work from everything from direct service, working into building staffing and retention strategies and systems. Currently, my focus is on organizing the ABA C.A.R.E.S Summit, which is happening in August this year if you're listening in 2026. And I also host the People Contingency Podcast, where the same focus, but I bring on experts and listen and ask questions. So I'm usually on the other side of the seat, which is what I was telling Nate. Hopefully, I do you proud because I'm normally the person who asks questions, not answers them. But yeah, so I focus on that with my podcast to try to give some great solutions. We focus on leadership, hiring, things like of that nature for the field.
Yeah. Well, I knew from when I first interacted with you that you would have a lot to offer, especially you come with, in particular, a recruiting background, um, among other things. And so, yeah, I actually wanted, before I go into the next question beyond this, I actually want to circle back to something that you were sharing initially there. When you're hiring people, are you mostly just trying to, I heard you talk about the clarity as being very important. Or is that mostly coming through in even like where you're posting or the job description? Like, is the main feeder still just like online search, or is there some other thing that I should be aware of that I have no idea about for how to find applicants, like that very top of that funnel?
Yeah, I do a lot of searching too. So a lot of sourcing, like so passive sourcing as well. A
Can you
lot
explain
of
what that means?
Yeah, thank you for that. I forget that, when you use the same terminology. So passive means that the individual is not necessarily looking for a job, right? So that could look like many different things. So it could mean that you're passive sourcing. Many people do it on Indeed, right? And so you might put in the qualifications of what you're looking for. Let's say you're working with staff or with clients, patients that have suicidal ideation. So I might, search for RBTs or DSPs, and then add in suicidal ideation. And it'll pick up on words that potentially they use in their resume to kind of slim it down. And then I reach out to them and try to, engage in a conversation and pull them over into looking for a job. I also use LinkedIn. I'm a little nerdy. I like to say my autism is a gift because I notice patterns, which really helps me actually in recruiting. So I can see patterns of people's behaviors on LinkedIn on when they're probably going to be looking for a job. And so that's really helpful for me to be able to say, hey, like I noticed that your banner behind, disappeared. You no longer are like flying your company colors. Are you does that mean you're looking? You might not be, but maybe you are. Or I noticed that you're celebrating a lot of people starting a new job. Are you yourself looking for a new job? So it shows that I am paying attention to the individual. And it also indicates, usually those indicators are accurate. So that's another way. It could mean, if you're looking for RBTs or DSPs, depending on, again, the specific patients that you're treating, it could mean hanging out where nannies hang out, hanging out where paraprofessionals are, people that are adjacent that maybe don't know about the work that you do that might be interested. So those would be some kind of passive ways that you could, or some ways that they're very active, they're not passive, but some ways that you could get passive job searchers
Mm.
into your fold.
Okay, I'm not literally taking notes, but because this is recording, I'm seriously taking notes because there's a lot to learn here. But I'm also thinking that I heard it a real um you almost like stopped and hesitated at the beginning to really emphasize this point that you're not about just going through interviews. You're not about just getting people to day one and thinking that that's the win. When do you know? How do you know? And when do you know if someone's not a good fit? Like if you were especially for frontline staff. So there's not like, I mean, to me, it feels more obvious if someone's more advanced in their career. Like, well, do they really have the prerequisite skills? Now, picking between people might be equally hard, but kind of like, do they hit that basic benchmark? I feel like might be easier. Maybe I'm wrong than someone that's a frontline worker. And so, yeah, go ahead, share with us.
You're exactly right. It is tricky. I think there's some very easy ways you can tell if you have some parameters, right? So if you need somebody who's available from 3 to 7, and they're not, then they're obviously not fit right there. But I listen for more subtle clues like the maybes. So I like to ask, tell me about a time that you've worked with an individual who's been aggressive. Like, what's the most aggressive example you can give me? And so that way I know what aggressive means to them and I know what it looks like for my patient. And so if there's a mismatch there, then I have to do a little bit more investigation to say, have you ever seen and have you ever witnessed? Because if you ask somebody, are you comfortable with X behavior and they're looking for a job, they're like, oh, yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, I think I could, of course. Yeah, I'm willing. I want to do good work. I want to help. And while that sounds great, like, yeah, sure, I do want to learn. That is very different than understand what you're saying to me and I know that I've at least seen it to know that I can do this, or at least more confidently. I prefer if you actually have examples doing it, but even witnessing it. Now, if you say yes, you can do something and you really have no clue, that's a no. Like I'm like, okay, cool. And that's a no for me. So, it's a lot of listening to how people are answering the questions, the words that they choose, how they evaluate. And then it's really understanding both sides of the organization and the candidate that you're listening to know if there's enough support for both of each other, for both sides to be a good match. Because they might be good for the role, but not good for the company.
Okay, have you seen that on a number of occasions?
Yes. So I have individuals who um, have, maybe been exposed more in a personal setting. Either maybe they work in a room with special needs for in their church, or they have family members. So kind of extended, but not in the role where they are actually managing the behaviors in high intensity or frequency or in a healthcare setting. And so when I'm, speaking with them, if I know I'm working with an organization that provides a really good foundation and also continued mentorship and support, I am more likely to place somebody who is on I would say what would be my fence in terms of being able to be a good fit for the role. So I think that they have the personality. I would welcome them into my house with my children as a nanny or whatnot, but maybe they're not ready for the next level of healthcare. But in an organization that can support it, then I'm more apt to push them through to that next round to see if it's for them.
Okay, no, I'm tracking with what you mean by that because yeah, the level of support and kind of even just the culture around onboarding and ongoing mean, everybody in air quotes does ongoing training, but it's really different at some organizations versus others. Yes, absolutely.
Exactly. Hmm.
Now, in ABA and in IDD, these are emotionally demanding entry level roles, which is sort of like a setup already. Okay. I didn't even mention not paying well. Okay. Let's just throw that in the mix too. And there's a ton of responsibility. Okay. The list could go on. But is there any myths out there that are hurting agencies when it comes to hiring or some of this early turnover that you've seen that maybe a mindset or a myth that's just still prevalent?
So I actually have a couple myths that that popped in my mind, but the one in terms of hiring that I see that it actually does more damage than you would think. So would be hiring, the speed of hiring is the most important metric, that doesn't really equal quality, right? And so that's not really how it works. So I think getting really honest that looking at that number and reinforcing your recruiters for the speed of hire is something that I'd watch for. Of course, it is important to make sure you're not losing quality candidates, but you want to make sure that you're not just moving through without thinking of quality. So on my podcast, I actually had Peter Capelli, who's at the professor at the Wharton School, and he mentioned, and I like the way he put it, so I'll kind of use what he said, which is if you were to judge things by speed and you were going to, like, for example, think about restaurants, then McDonald's by definition would be quality restaurant and the best restaurant would be McDonald's, right? But we all know that it's not. And so you have to make sure that you're looking at quality metrics to make sure that you're getting quality hires because that is very important. So I would say that is a myth, is to focus on that metric. Would not be one that I would recommend to be the most important one.
Okay, I want to lean into this for a moment. If an organization is feeling the kind of pressure that I threw you into, and it sounds like you've literally experienced with that first question, what does balance look like between trying to, if they're just, burning through overtime costs with vacancies that have just been, they're just sitting there, what does that balance look like in your estimation?
It's hard. Um, I mean, balance is hard, but I'd like to point out the imbalance that maybe you're not seeing, and so I'd rather focus on looking at the cost of what that quick hire looks like versus being able to make a better hire and having them stay. So first, I guess that's calibration, right? And just I want to make sure that the leaders understand that. So one thing is, like, when you are desperately hiring and it feels like you're moving slow, it feels counterintuitive, but you need to balance with the fact that when you churn everybody so quickly, you're actually having this ripple effect on your company, and financially it's not a good business model anyway. But I kind of think of it this way: if you're filling a bathtub, right, and you have the faucet on all the way, and it's filling in quickly, but the drain is open, that does no good. You're never going to actually get a full bathtub. So even if the bathtub was running at a slower water speed, but the drain was closed, aha, eureka, it took longer, but we have a nice warm full bathtub. And so if you think of it in that way, slower does not always mean better or even balance. And so I would say just mind your emotions about it, and kind of sit back a little bit, and don't think of speed as the enemy, if you will.
Okay. That bathtub, I'm a metaphor guy, so I was like right there with you as soon as you start sharing that, like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, if you're trying to, yeah, that just makes a lot of sense inherently. What do you think a good messaging looks like? I can just imagine right now a leader's listening to this, and maybe there's an HR director or somebody like that, could be executive director, and they're like, yes, this makes sense. What's the messaging that's needed both in two places? One would be with those that are responsible for recruiting. So whether that's the generalist at a smaller place or whether it's just full on recruiter at a larger organization. So what's the message that's needed there to get at what you're talking about? But then also, what do you think the messaging needs to look like for frontline supervisors and managers who feel like they're drowning and are, you know, like frustrated that the candidates aren't coming fast enough or new hires aren't coming fast enough? What do you think that messaging looks like?
It's interesting. You know, for I always like to start with questions before I start to try to work on the messaging. And so, really getting at their why they do things or where that urgency is coming from, what is really driving their anxiety, their rush, and really pinpoint it so that then when we're having the conversation of quality versus speed, we're likely circling back to you want to make sure that your patient is having consistent care, right? You want to make sure that you are not managing parents, being upset. You want to make sure that you're able to fulfill and, your quotas and do a good job, all the things, right? But if we look back and we talk about having somebody hiring quickly and not for quality, then those things don't really align when you go down the road and you start really looking at it. Okay, well, let's look at some examples of when we've hired fast. Let's look at how many of those individuals worked out and whether or not it goes back to what you're telling me your why is and what is important to you. Like, let's just make sure that this matches. Because again, it makes sense to say, well, let's turn on the water on as high as it can go and fill up this bathtub. It makes sense, right? But if you start to again just kind of slow down and look and be able to go back to the logic of hiring better, people start to see it. It's not always easy. Not everybody's happy, but it does help.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I want to flip something around now. The other end of the spectrum. If an organization has maybe a clunky application, software, or if they, you know, say like, well, we'll wait for your background checks, and then they don't reach out to the candidate for 3 weeks because the FBI check takes forever and they've lived in 10 states. So now they're, those background checks can take a while. What what's needed there? What does that look like if suppose you just kind of got hired in that recruiter role or as an advisor even to an organization where there's those types of problems? What kinds of things would you be saying to them?
Really glad that you asked this question because I do want to point out that it doesn't mean you don't remove barriers to speed. So I'm more talking like if you're going to, interview DSPs, RBTs, and you instead of doing a 15-minute interview and saying yep it's a body hired, I mean more like evaluations. But to your point, there are going to be different barriers that have to get removed. So making sure that you are still tracking where the barriers are hitting so that and then solve them as long as they don't um, affect the quality. And so in your example, making sure that you are investing in tech that can speed up the background check and that you are then if you can't, that you're still engaged with the candidate or the potential hire, that you are filling the latency of your tech and some of those things that are outside of your control. Fill that and solve that by connection then, because there you can't always, right, affect all the things that are going to slow things down. But yeah, if you have, let's say you're a recruiter, and I experience this all the time. And so I'd imagine that I am not alone. But you speak to a great candidate, they're so great, and then they've got to go into the clinical for an interview. And then the clinical person just keeps getting back and delaying when they're going to speak to that candidate, delaying and delaying and delaying. Or you also then need to get the feedback after the interview before making the offer, but you don't hear that. So tightening that process, that standard operating procedure up is crucial. So that part of the fast of when you're looking at something is very important. And as a recruiter, advocate for that because and take data on it. If you're losing, really quality candidates because of a slow process that is not slow for the sake of quality, then try to remove that barrier. Absolutely.
So I hear a big differentiation then between we're purposefully making sure that our gate only opens to those we want it to open to with long-term thinking in mind versus, well, we're just kind of drowning in everything. And so we're not fixing our software that people get kicked off of. And so we lose a candidate or we're getting not it's not laziness. It's not, and it's never purposeful, but we're not going to stay on top of being in touch with them when we're literally waiting on a clearance that's outside of everyone's control, and it just is taking longer than expected, and not keeping that flow of communication steady. So yeah, I think I'm hearing that like a big differentiation in what you're sharing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Um, do you do you think that there's any interview question or questions? I mean, this could lead to a long answer, but or hiring practices that are either skipped or underestimated?
Yeah, so I would say something that's underestimated would be having a partnership type of a conversation. So follow-up questions are often skipped. So it's when you're looking at interviewing, a lot of times it's a checkbox. Did I ask this question? Yes, cool, check. But you're not actually listening to evaluate, can I evaluate the answer that the candidate gave? And if not, is there something I need to dig to get? And so I would say oftentimes the follow-up questions are underestimated, and often, you know, I would say skipped. Yeah.
Okay. I think when you were first sharing, so I don't have much of a recruiting background whatsoever. I mean, I've been involved in hiring a little bit, so I personally don't have that experience or knowledge per se. But I really was paying attention to the way that you are listening for if a candidate gives an unclear answer or is kind of vague about it, or if they're enthusiastic about it versus they're weathered. You didn't say the word weathered, but when you're talking about intense behaviors, I think that's kind of what it feels like. Like if you've been through the fire, you've been through the fire. You can look around, and you say, "Yeah, these are my battle scars on my arm here. I know what this is like." Versus someone that's just maybe eager to learn, and they might be a great person. But I heard how you really would hone in on that and you would lean in with for follow up questions with them. So that makes sense. Yeah, if you're trying to quote have the same interview for everybody, but then you don't actually get the most important information, it sounds like it kind of would miss the point.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think the other thing is too, I'll give another example of a question that you could do this with is when you ask somebody, what's your availability for this role? What does that look like? 9 times out of 10, you get, "I'm available whenever." Like, I can do whatever the patient needs, like, I'm there, right? And that is usually what you get. And then I like to ask some follow questions. "Great. What does that look like? What's the earliest time that you can arrive?" And they're, "Well, I gotta drop off my child, at childcare, and so usually that's, so now we're looking at, like, maybe 9 o'clock would be preferred." "Okay, cool." And then, like, "What's the latest you wanna work?" "Well, I like to get home, but and that turns into 4 p.m. And oh, I have this." And then you start actually talking about their life. And all of a sudden you realize, okay, so it's not really literally whenever. Okay, and which is fine. But like, let's then get to the root of it. And then let's think in 6 months, what I heard you say is that you want to, start at 9, you want to end at 4. Does this look the same in 6 months in a different season or whatnot? And so it's really spending time on things where I get a lot of pushback when I'm training recruiters, but I've already asked the question, they already answered it. Right. They answered what you wanted to hear, but now you're being a partner, a thought partner, and you're actually advising them. So you need more information to advise them. So digging on questions like that is super helpful, especially with DSPs and RBTs because of the hours that are needed.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of those positions, at least I know for sure with DSPs, can be overnight or not even equally overnight. It might be from, 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., or maybe it's a 20-hour shift or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of variation there. Uh, you've already shared some about this, but I'd like to dig around a little bit more. You talked about how retention is something that starts before someone's hired. It's not an afterthought. You're thinking about it from the whole process of recruitment, and that therefore it started beforehand. Can you can you share what are some of the most crucial, if you had to break down just some of the most crucial things that really help to make sure that you've done all that you can do to make it likely that this person's going to be sticking around, not just sticking around, but I mean engaged and really integrated into the organization?
Sure. I would say, recruitment is a lot like dating, and relationships at work are important relationships. And so don't catfish each other, right? Essentially what happens, right? There's a lot of catfishing on both sides for the candidate who wants the job and then the person, the organization that wants to hire. And so what I mean by that is don't bait and switch. Be very intentional on your marketing that you're sharing. Don't, say that you have this amazing culture if you're working on an amazing culture. Be honest about it so that when somebody, is saying yes to a job or you're saying yes to them, both of you need to have the information in order to make a long-term relationship. And that starts with trust. It starts with knowing yourself. They say don't get into a relationship until you've worked on yourself or know who you are and what you want. Same thing here. Get really intentional in the organization and be and kind of work out what it is and who you are before you maybe even on it. And I should say sometimes it's unintentional catfishing, right? But spending the time to really be intentional on it is really important.
Okay, that's great insight. Wow, that was just outstanding. There are so many key takeaways that I had to really stop and think what would be the action move I'd recommend. But this is what I've landed on, and certainly you can take away whatever your own takeaway is. My suggestion would be take a look at this whole issue around the speed of hiring and do an audit of your own hiring process and even some of the onboarding process, and try to make sure that you're keeping the bar high where you want it to be high, and that might slow down the process a little bit, right? Not rushing through interviews, things like this that she shared. But then make sure that you don't have any unnecessary friction points or where it's slow because it's kind of a little bit sloppy or it's almost kind of accidental, not on purpose that it's being slow on your end. And just simply do an audit. And I'm sure that will lead to some fascinating discoveries along the way. And it will probably point directly to where you should target some energy to improve your own hiring process. And that will help the recruitment and the retention all at one time. Now, I also want to just refer you to a resource. If you have supervisors at your organization that you know could just use a little bit more support and resource, then not only do I offer the Leadership Lab, which you can check out on the website, which is about helping supervisors become more competent and confident as leaders, where they become retention ambassadors. Not only that, but I have, even before that, a very simple free download you can get that covers 7 quiet danger signs your supervisors are burning out their teams. When people kind of get thrust into leadership, a lot of times they don't really know the part about managing people. And so inadvertently, supervisors often are drivers of turnover, which is why I created this resource. It also gives solutions as to what you can do depending on which sign of burnout is happening at your organization. Anyhow, feel free to check it out. It's at iddleader.com/burnout. Well, I can't wait to get back for part 2 on the next episode that releases, and you'll get to hear what Beth is sharing, not just about the recruitment side, but also even more of how the retention piece is so interconnected. So until next time, here's to you. Keep up the amazing work.